To formulate a project today is to navigate a landscape of abstractions. We can no longer treat the site merely as a physical plot, nor the program as a simple list of functions. Instead, we work within a kind of media ecology where mathematical thinking and digital literacy are as fundamental as the drawing itself. In this environment, architecture is not about simplifying complexity, but about filtering it, finding the invariants, the codes, the deeper structures that allow a project to hold its ground amidst the noise. Our guest today, Professor Vera Bühlmann, operates precisely in such an interval between the poetic and the computation. Vera Bühlmann is Professor of Architecture Theory at TU Wien, where she directs the research unit for architecture theory and philosophy of technics. Her work has been central in reframing how architectural thinking engages with computation, mathematics, and media. Through books such as Mathematics and Information in the Philosophy of Michel Serres and The Digital, a Continent, she develops a theory of digital architectonics that treats information not merely as data, but as a material condition with its own poetics. Her writing constructs a bridge between mathematical abstraction, rhetorical tradition, and the operational demands of contemporary techniques, inviting as such architects to rethink how conceptual literacy shapes the very grounds on which a project becomes thinkable. In this episode, we turn to the themes that shape her recent thinking on mathematics and techniques. We discuss the shift from evolution to involution, that is, the folding of knowledge inward until it becomes a lived literacy rather than an external method. We ask how architects might move beyond the conquering mindset of engineering toward what she names the Portico of the arts, where abstraction, rhetoric, and techniques meet without hierarchy. And we consider how this reframing allows the project to emerge not as a solution to a predefined problem, but as an orientation, a way of becoming attuned, even friendly, to the obstacles that give a site its form. These are the themes that will guide us in the episode ahead. I'm your host, Irinel Pintillier. Welcome to Contrapposto. Welcome, Professor Bühlmann. Thank you very much for joining me today.
It is my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
So before we dig into more serious stuff, I'd like to briefly frame the overall topic for the current series of episodes. A bit of like this red thread that goes through all of them. Mm-hmm. So we are concerned with three, I would say, rather familiar terms to every architect at least. So we talk about site, program, and what I call the problematic. So while site and program are a bit often taken for granted, I would say the third is a bit more elusive in this setup. So our aim is to reopen these terms a bit, not to redefine them, but how can we rethink them in today's climate with people with different backgrounds, but still related to architecture. So we can ask, what do we call a site today? Is it simply a regulated parcel, or can it be understood in a more layered manner, with including historical, ecological, socioeconomic entities? What do we mean then by program? Is it merely a list of functions, or is it a negotiation with the site? Can it be adapted to the site? With the problematic, I think this is a bit harder to articulate. I know it can be easily to go to the idea of a problem, but I don't know, I want to distance it a bit from the idea of a problem. So it wouldn't be about, in my conception, the problematic is not about the problem itself or how to solve the problem, but how to relate to the project how to relate it through a constellation of tensions within the project, how to orient the project, what would be the conceptual, what would be the ethical core of the project with the problematic. So it's not about solving the problem, but how to tune it a bit, if problematic can be in itself a mediator between site and program. I would try to think it like this. I will toss the ball to you in a minute. I don't want to go into long monologue right now about this. I'm sure we can dig into these topics shortly. So you have a very large biography, and you have edited and published quite a large amount of books at this point. As a first question, as a warm-up, I'd like to just for our viewers to get to know you a bit. What would be your research trajectory? How did you end up in architecture theory? What is architecture theory about, briefly, and a philosophy of techniques above all?
Yeah, nice. Yes, so I am not myself an architect. My original studies were in literature and linguistics, so language and philosophy. And then I more and more got interested in the question of technology, and it's already quite, or for me, it was very much related to a similar interest, perhaps in the problematics that you started to introduce a bit, because it becomes very difficult, but also very philosophical when we start to talk about techniques, not with regards to functions, tasks, purposes, that would already be rationalized. So there's a potential and a kind of an domain of potentiality or something which is not actual that pertains to techniques per se, which is neither quite subjective only, nor is it something like regulated by natural laws and evolutionarily determined or something like this. And in my studies, this became a bit the focus then in my, both in my period while I was writing my PhD, which was in Basel in Switzerland with a philosopher in media studies. It was on this question, but at the same time I was working at the Art Academy at that time, which in Switzerland were just freshly in the situation that they had to invent what research is in art. And by research, it's not to say that they did not do research before, but in the political, in the institutionalized sense. So the academies were changed into statues of universities, and they had access to funding programs and needed to develop protocols of how to keep track of what they are doing and develop standards and all these things. And this was my time during my PhD. So I was working at the art school in this direction, and privately I was writing my PhD. Very soon then on the notion of the virtual. I wanted to know what mediality and mediation and the virtual, what these things, not so much only what individual thinkers mean by them, but what they can give us today with the electric and the electronic and quantum physical kind of transformations. So this is a bit my background. It is not so surprising, perhaps, that with this interest, it is more and more abstract categories that became important to become more precise. So how have people been thinking of space? How have they been thinking of energy and of information and of matter? So my trajectory then from already in this phase, but then also beyond my PhD, was very much something that used to be called perhaps natural philosophy. So kind of a refusal to say here is philosophy and here is science, or here is the arts and here is science and there is philosophy, but to say there is a kind of a quickness to ideation, which of course has history, so it's not a classification system or something like that, but a kind of an ecology of thought, an ecology of minds. This is also the aspect I always sympathized with in regard to cybernetics, to the whole movement of cybernetics. And after my PhD, then I was invited to develop this thinking by an architect in the context of digital architecture at ETH Zurich. And then this became an interesting experience because it really kind of placed me in a context where First of all, I no longer have to struggle against how usually the disciplines treat problems, because it's also quite comfortable sometimes to say that here I want to be transgressive and here I want to do it differently, So this was not an issue anymore. It was just, you can do what you want, what would be right now to do, more or less. So it was quite a different mode. So, and for me, it meant the interest became less focused on discourses. So on the formats, let's say, I was socialized with from the humanities, and more on really literacy in terms of handling techniques. I started to speak of coding literacy, and at the same time, a more rigorous kind of appreciation of the thinking that went into these inventions. So really to read Shannon and the mathematicians on the developments in algebra and in everything that kind of gets subsumed when in media theory, which is called a computer in German, ein Rechner, because yes, it calculates, but most of all it's algebra, and it's algebra of a very, very abstract kind, far more abstract than the calculus from the Baroque times of Leibniz and so on. And this changes, it has great impact for the discourses. And what kind of happened is that the ways I started to speak about it had less and less context where it fits. But where it kept to be interestingly, was actually in discussions with architects, and then also mirrored in myself getting more and more familiar with architecture theory, not through the optics as is far more common through art history or a history of architecture or history of ideas even, but through how do architects write these books, because there is an outspoken affirmation of rhetorics and a very clear kind of dedication even to link a theoretical stance with branding of an Entwurfs philosophy, for example, or of kind of a public identity, which insofar as I was working with artists in this research context was not there, because in the research context, they always wanted to have a kind of a sober academic parallel praxis to the praxis of them as artists. So they wanted to keep this separation quite strict, which I found very limited in the potential already there and still today. And with architects, it was not so much like that. So they were, in many ways, much more relaxed with this academic research and much more familiar with a kind of what I would call a natural philosophy understanding of a generalistentum, so of basically knowing more or less state-of-the-art ideas in fields that appear perhaps quite distant to the actual practice. At least there are many architects who feel like that, and also an appreciation for abstraction. So in the humanities, in my fields, it was always, so to kind of like abstraction was something one would almost have to feel guilty of a bit. So it's a bit like a bad conscience, because it's associated to crudeness and to dominance and to power and so on. And it always felt like the one of the main atmospheres where it would be acceptable and tolerated is in the terms of social planning, basically. So sociology, a kind of a programmatic vector for what they should be useful for, of which one could demonstrate evidently that it will be by all good sense for the better of the future somehow. And coming from literature, this is not really where my passions were. It was about useless abstractions. It was about the things that are fascinating just because they are possible, they can be done, or they have been done. And about, these kinds of, I call it today meteora climates or milieus. But so after my PhD, I started to work at ETH in the context of digital architecture. We soon started to speak of digital architectonics, because it was less about problem solving and optimization in the engineering approach, but more and more in these architectonic abstractions. And then I I applied. I was invited to apply for here. I would not have thought to do that because I did not feel competent in architecture theory. It is not my background, and I am not working historically. But then I presented my work with this literacy aspect, the coding literacy. I called it quantum literacy as well, because there is an interest that merges with new materialisms and these kinds of more media and cultural theory approaches that are interested in methods and in materiality and in practices, very much in agents, forms of agency today. And then, to my great joy, I was offered the position to develop it. And this was almost 10 years ago, 9 years ago from now. Yeah.
Next year is going to be the anniversary.
Yeah.
Dual rostrum. You mentioned earlier you're interested in rhetorics. And I often heard you talk about the relation that it has to architecture, at least for architectonics. And you also link it either to mathematics on one hand, but also to mechanics.
Mm-hmm.
Do you only see it in just in a triad,
Mm-hmm.
a triptych, or what's the relationship between them? Is it like an isomorphism that you see, or do they empower one another?
I see them more as a constellation, so they don't need to be looked at in relation to each other. Of course, rhetorics can be looked at in relation to poetics or to grammar as well, or to logics, but it can be looked at in relation to mathematics. And if one does, it is a particular understanding of mechanics, which starts to come to the foreground, that gets eclipsed, for example, if we link a geometry directly with logics. Because mechanics used to, that's the origin of the Greek origin of the term mechane, it meant to be resourceful, to treat something resourcefully. So with Vorstellungskraft, no? With a kind of an abandoned eine übermütige, I often call it, die übermütige Intuition. So something unbound, something overspilling. And we rarely associate this today to how we speak of mechanics. We much more associate mechanics with predetermined structures or laws, very clearly defined scopes of possibility. But in early times, pre-modern times, techniques and arts, they were like two sides of the same coin. They were not two different things. And my interest in rhetorics, mathematics, and mechanics comes precisely from this. We can think the two together if we put them in this constellation. So if mathematics does not represent true situations, let's say, or lawful configurations in a neutral way, or I don't know what the ideas are, which think that mathematics just gives us logical descriptions of things or necessary structures. But there's a fashioning with mathematics. So many things, especially in technology, shows this. Many things can be described mathematically in very diverse ways. So with different kinds of mathematics.
But at the same time, we should not think of mathematics as applied.
As applied?
Applied mathematics.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's why. Yes. So if applied mathematics means problem solving and optimization in a purely analytical way, then not. But on the other hand, there is this still for me fascinating. Maybe it's a scope of deliberation, or it has something to do with breathing in the air of freedom. Also, no. So we can make things up which are not fiction. So it's fantastic. With mathematics, we can start to refer to things which are entirely, they appear nonsensical, no, absurd, not useful, but they follow from some very abstract considerations which are systematized and elaborated and which need to be accommodative of many things outside. So they're not pure abstractions. I never knew what this should be at all, because an abstraction needs to dwell with the other abstractions with which it networked and it associates. No? And technology is very much concerned with that. And I always was flirting with this inversion, so that the applied mathematics is not there to bring things to the ground and make them heavy, but applied virtuality is what technology can do to elevate things, to lift them up from the ground, to bring them into a probability space, into a kind of an objective chance domain, where they are augmented with a certain indeterminism at the same time as they are being determined in mathematical terms. So yes, applied is difficult, but I also still don't want to let go of it entirely. My first book series is called Applied Virtuality for this reason, the one about literacy.
Yes, you have. This is actually, I'm going to breathe now that you have edited and coordinated a few series of books. One of them being Applied Virtuality.
Yeah.
The other one, the newest one, is Architectonic.
Meridian Architectonics.
Meridian Architectonics, yes.
Yeah.
And with Meridian Architectonics, you're already now on the second publication.
We have two, and the third one will be coming very soon.
Will be coming very soon with a journal on Comedia, right?
A condition of Comedia, yeah.
Yes. But the second one is particularly interesting, which is the mathematical thinking and evolution for architects by Professor Vera Bühlmann, which you have forwarded. And I suppose it will make much of our talk today, this one specific text, because you outline and you set up a very nice scene into mathematical thinking for architects specifically. And I'm very glad that you mentioned before this idea with mechanics and with the mechanic, which means resourceful, to be resourceful. But another term in this constellation is involution, which is not an inversion either. How exactly is this to be conceived in the spectrum of mathematical thinking?
Yeah.
And why is it important for architects to put on the table?
Yeah, this has something to do with so there's the technicality of these developments. When we want to learn coding literacy and we learn the program or even the understanding better the mathematics, but this usually plays out in a kind of discourse space where you would have different histories pointing towards a certain tendency, or you would have different interpretations of the history or of the positions. And it's interesting to read, of course, the documents by Schrödinger and Shannon, for example, and to say, okay, they are talking about the same thing. Neither of them knew how to put it right. So it's a live talk about something which cannot yet be spoken about plainly. So there's something very poetic in these moments. But still, this is always about kind of learning to understand where we are. So a kind of mapping, a kind of finding a place in the exterior to oneself. It has something to do with being outside, let's say. And this evolution is something that it took me quite a while to understand its importance, because a literacy, we cannot learn it. That's the thing. A literacy, we cannot learn it like we learn, I don't know, a certain. We learn how to follow certain rules in order to achieve something. A literacy is an interiorization to the degree that we forget that we did not always do this. No, so a literacy has something to do. It has not so much. Of course, it translates into quantitative things like how large is your vocabulary that is active in use, and how large is your passive vocabulary, and how fluent are you in several languages, and how easy does it come to you to translate between language. And so, of course, they all play a role. But what really matters is that one interiorizes everything one knows about languages and speaking and literature. So not to be able to put a tag to every phenomenon that we encounter, but to basically forget all of that, such as to have, again, encounters, which are not primarily mediated through filters and through taxonomy somehow. And this is a term then that Elias Zafiris, he brought in with involution, because in mathematics it has a beautifully symmetric kind of dynamics. It has a more precise meaning, of course, but it has something to do with this. It means a kind of a folding in, so an involution, a folding in, and then a folding in not in order to build a stock, no, the reservoir, and to be filled with it, but it really has to do with rearrangement of of our heads. No, Montaigne said already this was the 15th century when the printing press started to to bring knowledge into circulation like never before. And then Montaigne had this famous statement that it's worth much more to have a well-organized head than a filled one. So it's these kind of processes. The evolution has something to do with reorganization. So in that sense, it has something to do with technology being truly a prosthesis, so a kind of an extension of our bodily, and in that sense now I also think of cognitively bodily predispositions or forms of organization, and an enlargement of it. So it's a prosthesis not as a compensation for a weakness, but it's a prosthesis as a kind of a reaching out into previously not familiarized, today we would say frequencies, maybe now, spectra of things. And this, now I lost the connection to your question, I'm afraid.
No, why do we need to think it as a revolution for architects? Yes.
Yeah. Yes, because it's, so if we speak, I mean, the title of his book, and that's also has always been the title for his courses, Mathematical Thinking.
Yeah.
Today, many people would say this is nonsense, or is it pure esoterics? Because in mathematics, everything is rule determined. So there is no thinking, if by thinking we don't mean a kind of a calculation or a computation that is purely mechanical. And his insistence is, no, it's not like that. So in mathematics, in order to grasp it, not just to perform like a robot with it. Yes. So without having an active relation to what one does, this is what I mean with performing like a robot. Mm-hmm. Without having a consciousness and an active relation, it does not need to be, I mean, of many things that we think about, we are of course also not conscious, so it's tricky to speak of it, but I mean this active relation. And in order to have this to mathematics, of course it is thinking, but it's a kind of a thinking that does its work in us more than us directing what we wanted to achieve. So it's an interiorization. It's like a literacy, or in German this word das Können. No? So when we through exercise, through also sometimes painful, repetitive and stupid exercises, there are points when we get it, and then everything looks different, and we can hardly remember how this was not always there. And it has something to do with this. And mathematics, to think of mathematics like that, is not the main understanding of mathematics today. That's very different. And to accentuate it and to kind of begin to tell stories that would be more accessible, because people get quite afraid if mathematics is not necessary exactly in the way that experts tell you it needs to be. People get quite afraid about that for reasons that I still don't quite understand. It has something to do with the kind of power of the spirit, not in any religious sense, no, but the mind. So where do our ideas, how does it happen that a thought just obsesses you? So we're not entirely in charge of this, and psychology can explain a lot, but also not really. So I think it has something to do with this, but I'm not too sure. But it's about, my foreword was very much to go in a kind of, so to tell stories and to reawake somehow imaginaries that are familiar enough so people don't need to be afraid. And also they don't want to seek confrontations, no, or to become polemic or to develop a theory out of this.
Yeah, but what is interesting with mathematics, and how Professor Zafiris always makes it out to be like this, is that mathematics is a living body.
Yeah.
It breathes.
Yeah.
And I think, at least for me, this puts into perspective this idea with the mechanics that we were talking about earlier. So this interiorization that you mentioned, it's in a way this kind of mechanization as well. Yeah. But is this in where you become resourceful? Yeah. It's not a mechanization where you're just a robot, but it's a mechanization where you become resourceful with ideas, they become second nature to you, that you don't need to be conscious in order to perform them, but they just come fluently towards you. This is how I always, or at least lately, I try to relate to this idea of how mathematics can work for us.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring it so clearly to this point, because that's the thing with mathematics. No, it's not like fiction where an author invents it all and manages to do it convincingly. There is always the resistance, which is not human-made. So we don't know. We cannot make really ultimately. On surface levels, yes, there is a lot of design and of shaping and of predispositioning and so on. But ultimately, there are certain things which just cannot be built to be differently. I mean, luckily, and it's crazy that we can, with mathematics, fly to the moon and come back. So survive, be so precise and adequate in all the calculations that it actually works. It's pure speculation on the one hand, but on the other hand, it has this. So it is tuned with what the idea always calls this a body of its own somehow. And like this, it's also, we don't need to think when we say ideas, there is an objectivity to ideas, or ideas have a life of their own. They're not our properties. It's not that we own the ideas which we spend time with or which we find interesting, but they lie in the air. They are kind of climatic, or there is more an autonomy. Objectivity is a dangerous word to say here. It's not that really, but a kind of an autonomy of ideas where many people can engage at the same time in clarifying it. People like Charles Peirce with the abductive and the topological logics in the 19th century, they were very eloquent even about this point. But it's not very comfortable in today's customs, let's say. But that's one thing I'm very fond of in this approach. And the second is related to that because it also gives us a different way to relate to generations. So the other thing Elias now, and more often than a couple of years ago, what he keeps saying is that we must imagine that everything almost on which we base our comfort and our life today were crazy ideas invented by other people. They were not and it's not likely that these things are here, that they're possible. They're crazy in the sense of most people would not get the point. Why would one spend time thinking about this? But most of our infrastructures of our customs as well are thought out by people from earlier generations. So we really live on the shoulders of giants in almost every imaginable sense. But it doesn't mean we owe them. No, so that's the beautiful thing, because they just showed us how to take steps in a certain direction to engage with these ideas. But these ideas as well, they were not theirs. So they're not a property. So there's a kind of a fun thing which can give a gratitude to the ancestors and to the people from earlier times, a pure gratitude, and at the same time appear character in a kind of a contemporariness that goes diachronically. Yeah, and these are the two things with which he also starts Elias. So the two most important things for mathematical thinking is diachronicity and abstraction.
Yeah, and just to bring it back to our overall topic, with this idea of abstraction and diachronic validity, how would it relate to problematic? He always talks about obstacles.
Yeah.
Right? You see his theory, this is how he begins. What is an obstacle and how do we relate to it?
Yeah.
And this is precisely how, in a way, I wanted to frame this idea of problematic, that the obstacle itself is not a problem to be getting rid of it, but just something that we need to become friends with. Because actually, I think his quote is becoming friends with the obstacle. Mm-hmm. So he's not trying to eliminate it, mm-hmm. but trying to tune in the mathematical sense. Or he says, going to different domains in order to return, in order to make a universal covering space. How does one become a friend?
Is it
within this-
an obstacle?
Yeah.
Yes.
Because with they're relating to architecture, so let's say we struggle because we are trained to see architecture as a linear solution, to a defined need, in a sense, to address a certain needs. But this is hardly so that it's just a linear pathway towards an endpoint. So if we see a hill, then we need to flatten it in order to create a building. So we see traffic, we just block it, and then that's it. So this is, in a way, this kind of conquest mentality. But the shift is different here. It's not becoming friends. So becoming friends with the obstacle removes this conquest mentality.
Yes. I think in the way that you frame it now, the paraphrasing would somehow involve something like working out contracts. But contracts a bit like contracts not in the formal institutionalized terms, but more like when we try to describe Julia, what's his name? I forgot his first name. The French philosopher Julia. He has this beautiful book where he tries to speak about what makes intimacy. And intimacy is something shared. No? So it's not, but it's something shared and not objective. And he says intimacy is something that people can kind of contract among each other. And it starts to become what it is through a commitment to how one makes arrangements around this. So it's a kind of a notion of contract that has less to do with that has less to do. Yeah, it's hard. I also didn't think too much how to describe it, but it has something to do with. So this becoming friends has something to do with that. So one does not want to adjust the other to one's own expectations. It involves a kind of a respect and a coexistence that makes a lot of irrational compromises, no, or allows kind of negotiates. What can I settle with? No, what will be working in a period. Not forever, not now or never, or like this, or not at all, but let's say for the next period, for the next couple of moments or years or whatever. So that's what it means not to solve the problem, but to kind of find a way to tune with it. So not to be threatened by it and not to desire to make it right, no, or to be hygienic with regard to it, but to kind of be diplomatic and public, so to affirm the variety and the differences of what manifests in it, and yet feel committed to care for it and to find a coexistence that can carry further for a certain time. So it's not a momentary thing. It's a thing which has to do with familiarization and with things like that. And I think that would be the way now to respond from how you put it. But the term problematics, how I referred to it earlier, also has a different context, which is also interesting in regard to that. And it comes very much from Gilles Deleuze and Deleuze's philosophy, who is really a very inspiring figure in showing a certain, not quite anarchistic or anarchic, but a kind of a subversive potential in the stance of critique, which sees problems. No? So where a rationalist would face a paradox, Deleuze kind of suggests, let's just see a problem and let's become inventive and creative in figuring out how to deal with it. So problematics. So to engage with problems almost like a phenomenon, not like an objective thing or an impasse or a dead end or something like that. And the philosophically, the powerful story behind this approach is, of course, also that there is a certain history of mathematics which has really idealized the notion of axioms and axiomatics as the inbegriff of rational systematization. But it has never stopped until the current time that the way how to figure out how Euclid's books, not just the first 5, but all of his 12 or however many it is, how the notions, this kind of apparatus that he had set up in order to be theoretical about geometry, which is where axiomatics is coming from as a kind of a practice of rational systematization. This apparatus is not one, it's polyvalent in many ways. So the terms are used in different senses in the different books, some of them. And so it's not, axiomatics has never been much more like a kind of almost like a language or a rhetorical topos or something like that, a schematic topos perhaps, then a system. And there was this strict overemphasis to relate mathematics, because it is supposed not to allow polyvalency, deliberation, and all these things, resourcefulness, in a purely axiomatic way. So because then the idea was that mathematics is not affected by history. So, and it's true in many ways, no? So the mathematical theorems, they don't lose actuality. So maybe there are more general or more abstract ones that grasp more economically things that earlier formulations have already achieved. But the earlier formulations, they never get wrong with history. So there is a sense where they don't live in history. But this is only when we idealize this axiomatics, and when we say axiomatics itself is a kind of a literacy or a methodicity, perhaps, rather than a clear method, a methodicity, then it's a coexistence. So mathematical ideas, they age, they have a certain relation to time, they are affected by time, and yet at their core, they are not affected by it. This is possible to think together. And there's with this emphasis to shift, no, and he said, in many ways, he kept saying, no, we need to think about mathematics. We cannot leave mathematics to kind of bureaucratic Verwaltungsgehabe. So mathematics is a lively field. He was in love with Leibniz and with the beauty of this thinking, which was clearly dedicated to mathematics. So he was looking for ways to reconnect with that. And his strategy was to say, okay, instead of emphasizing axiomatics, we now emphasize problematics as a similar practice. And then there's a kind of a dialectics between the two, that the axiomatics is always almost like in historical revolutions, threatened by the problematics, which will not recognize the cleanliness of a certain axiomatic, so it cannot gain more power because there is a kind of a mass mobilization against its power, and then to turn it upside down and to bring a kind of a dialectics into this. And this was, for me, with regard to thinking of technology or techniques and the scope, this was very, very liberating and very beautiful. But today, it also remains constrained, because to think a plurality of axiomatic systems is much more difficult than to say there is a dominant one and now we need to go to minor scales or to kind of a more I don't know, better approaches, messier, but also more moral approaches or something like that. Because if we say there are many ways to be axiomatic, which contemporary category theory does. So it's not an overall system where you have a deductive logic, strong foundations, and then step by step, one thing follows from the other. It's not like that. It's more like a living body, like Elias keeps saying. Then axiomatics becomes very interesting again. And it has something to do with explicit and also logical. So really formal language to grasp the relations that we describe. But but with a vocabulary that comes more with homological algebra and the categories. So, and they're interestingly picking up a lot of the same notions that were constitutive for rhetoric. So topos and sheaf and motifs, and even the notion of a body of number. In German, it's called ein Zahlenkörper. Oh, it's not a Begriff von Zahlen. It's a body. Dedekind was talking of bodies of numbers, because there's a kind of an organic quickness to how they organize almost. So, and this is, So, and not to take position, no, either for problematics as a subversive kind of practice, or axiomatics as the discipline, no, that we call it the royal path to knowledge, no, so the kind of the noble, the most authoritative approach, but just to have maybe something like citizen science, no, where the abstractions can live in a not entirely rationalized way. So there is a commitment with mechanics always. There is a commitment to allow that ultimately we cannot explain it. No? So, but we also, we can delimitate the scope within which we make explanations, but ultimately we cannot explain. So the first course remains out of the scope of science. We need to speculate about that. And mechanics always was friends with this. And that's what Elias also shares with the mechanical tradition. So it doesn't need to be one rational system that would collapse if, I don't know, if a certain irregularity shows up.
Is this in any way, it doesn't need to be in any way self-evident, the axiomatics?
No.
No?
No, that's why you do proofs, because the proofs show that it can be demonstrated. But there is never, a proof is never an either or. So there is always, it's a long time since I did this, but to look at the history of proofs is you can really study chain transformations of mentalities with that. It's very interesting. And they don't contradict each other. But they can be more or less generous, I think.
Yeah. But with relation to axiomatics, you also talk about many times axiology.
Yeah. That's a different again, because that's not a mathematical term. Axiology comes from metaphysics. It has to do with ethics, with virtue ethics. And it was a term that was used, and still is, or again, is started to being used again, to think of values in constellations. So not rational, not as a system of deduction. So the most important, not in a ranking of ideas, not through an order, but in different constellations. So you always have at least three. So classically it was the good, the beautiful, and the true. And axiology means you don't need to decide which one of them is more important than the others. No? In certain respects, the beautiful is more important. In certain respects, the true. In certain respects, the good. But you cannot find one without involving the others. So this is a constellation. They're not points in an absolute. They just show up in a constellation. And then the idea is to have an axis around which the constellation circulates. And then you can study it in figurations, in different ways of appearing. And you don't produce contradictions with that, because you don't have a hierarchy or an order. So this is where axiology is coming from. And like this, you have in antiquity, this was called also, or it was related to so-called virtue ethics. That the values would not, they would always be something on the one, a bit like gravity and grace, no? So there would be something down to earth and very human, even if they're no scenes or something like that. But at the same time, in our relation to it, they could also be a trigger to elevate and to uplift and to for a kind of a spiritual growth. So they were always related. They were never related to representation. One could not just be good or do good. It was always an ethos involving a whole way of life, that one becomes who one is in how one acts ethically, basically. That's quite different from morals. Morals are much less, it's not me and myself, not with morals, or my role. And it's not symbolical like this, it's more representational and more as a collective.
Like related to a community rather than, or imposed in a community, the morals. Imposed through a community. The morals are always imposed through a community.
Yeah, it has something to do with the customs through
the customs and the common.
The social belonging. Yeah.
Yeah, this actually sheds quite nice light on the triad that I have right now with the site, the program and the problematic. I think what you just explained with the axiology, with the good, the beautiful, and the true, and this kind of constellation relationship is in a way how, at least I am looking at the three. Because in a project, you cannot have, and it's always the third that's missing, and that's why I chose now the problematic. It can be concept, it can be thematic for the project, but you cannot have a project without a site, and you cannot have a project without, let's say, for now the term program, right? And specifically this idea of figuration, I was actually looking at the text, the introduction to Grace and Gravity by Lars Spielberg, and I'm also thinking of the problematic itself as a figurative term that you get to turn what you find on site and what you bring with the program, and this needs a turn. This needs to be mediated, and this is where the problematic is, or the stance towards the project and actualization. And with regard to axiomatics and mathematical thinking, you also have another interesting term, which is the mathesic iconicity. And you mentioned earlier that it's not about representation. Yeah. It's just about patterns that allow us to witness somehow universal truths.
So on the one hand, we like these mechanics, mathesis, and also mathematics. In this philological history, it was not related to truth or to something immaterial. It was related to, in an operative way, to all that pertains to learning. Yeah. So mathematics meant everything that pertains to what can be learned. And it did not filter, this can be learned and this cannot be learned. Mm. It was a kind of an operational, a recursive, self-referential notion. That's at least one way of finding its history. And I was very interested in that because then there is a kind of an incorporation of methods in mathesis where the two are not on the same level. So it's not that method describes from an outside view the path you have to take in order to arrive at a certain event or a certain outcome, but method becomes much more like an ethos. So a way of living that you need to interiorize. And to the degree that you do, the more you can understand of things. So this is a kind of a mechanics almost that helped me a lot to grasp this interest in the literacy or this können, not being the ableness or the dexterity in things. And then the other thing, which I started to link with that, because it's not, so it needs to pick up, it cannot source out of itself. It's not creative in that sense. It's much more attentive. It's a kind of an active passivity, a receptivity that grows with the literacy. So when one grows capable of making distinctions where many people would not see distinctions, but one grows capable to do that because one knows what the implications are if we take them into account. So it's really an interiorized sense of familiarity with something quite abstract that we all know from things we do well, no? When we play a musical instrument or when we can, like a handyman, no? How they can operate the screwdrivers. I'm all fascinated. It's like a dance. So it's like their hands. It's beautiful. There's such an elegance if people are able to do something well. So everybody has something like that. But we all know this feeling, how it's different. And with the mathesis, it's like that. So mathesis does not construct out in a projective or in a programmatic sense, out of a certain well-reasoned plan or something like that. This kind of mathesis has something much more to do with being receptive in an active sense, to learn how to pay attention to things. And from learning how to pay attention, to grow a dexterity and an ableness to make distinctions adequate, of scopes and also of different scalarities, to cross different scales in adequate ways, which is hard to imagine if one is always quite tuned in a comfortable and familiar setup and terrain. So one needs to alienate, to estrange from the customs in order to grow this receptivity. And this is how I wanted to think of mathematics. But then the question is, well, where are these cues coming from? What then is one attentive to? And there are in philosophy, there are two main positions. Now, there is the people who go with the image and the people who go with text or with the word, so with hearing, with language or with the image. And since I would like to think of mathematics in this sense also as a kind of a language, a schematic language, which is free of semantics. Something that has a lot to do with all the abstract things, with grammars, with categories, with syntax also, but not in a descriptive way, but in German there is this term almost like in liturgy, no? Es muss vollzogen werden. So a side of performance, but not like in a spectacle, but enactment. So one has to do it. It's like learning to ride a bike means you need to ride a bike alone. So there's a dimension of Vollzug. One has to keep doing it again and again, like learning to draw characters when you learn how to write. So there's this dimension of an active interiorization, and in German, Vollzug, in Raum des Vollzuges, enactment, which is set free from particular semantics or particular structures of sense-making. And this is how this readiness of being receptive or learning to pay attention can grow. And so there is already this kind of, what I like about the abstractness of language is in the mathesic. And then I thought it's beautiful to think of the two as if they're wedded. No, so they're not the same. For me also, it's very important that the text is not one. No, it's not one. If it's one, there needs to be a hierarchy between them, or a kind of a dialectic revolutionary movement. And without a sexuality of this, there is no fertility, there is no nature, there is no conception. So there is. I was never fond of thinking of it like that. My alignment there is very clear with the feminists like Lucy Ray and also Michel Serres, of course. So, but then how to engage with that? And I came actually through mainly, I think, Albert Camus. This was it was very surprising to me to find this book, which he called Nuptials. It is a series of short stories about his hometown, and he was addressing the complexity of an existential experience of the natural wielding of powers, saturated and mixed with all the subjective private associations. It was his hometown, it was Algiers, he had everything entwined. And he called it, he was speaking of nuptials, something like cosmic nuptials. And then I started that was one path, there were others, but I started to think about this relation because eine Hochzeit in German means a high time, and it is very recent that Hochzeit was reserved to the legal marriage of a man and woman, but every festive moment was called eine Hochzeit earlier. And I think, but I haven't done research enough in this direction, but I think it was always about celebrating something like mythic or cosmic or, of course, sacred marriages. between saints or figures that are abstract in some sense. And then I thought, okay, maybe the mathesic iconicity could be a way to reawake a kind of a scope of ideation that connects with this without wanting to return not to the former traditions that would be not wise and not adequate, but to not be so hygienic with regards to trying to close out everything that smells a little bit of not pluralism or critical pluralism.
You talk now about nuptials. Do you think in any way that we can think of program as a nuptial, though as this act of consummation, or an act that needs to be consummated?
Yeah, that's interesting because what I was thinking, but I am not very literate in architecture. So I don't have a feeling what it means to determine the program, for example, or what you could do with it. But I understand is that the program is somehow an economization, a speculative economization of a site, where you just attribute square meters to functions. And you don't need to say how and no zoning, nothing like this. It's a numerical kind of expression. But this means it brings in for a house or for a project, it brings in a certain flow. So a circulation and a flow. And then we could say, and in modernity, the people like Mies and also, I think the Plan Libre starts a bit in this tradition. Yeah. They wanted to get rid of all verticality. They wanted to create a non-vertical, a pure horizontality that has a depth somehow, a generic kind of depth. This was with the modern, interestingly, with the geometry also in the modernist forms. But if we can separate a kind of a flow direction from a direction which means standing up, so aufrechtstehen, so a kind of a positioning, and then say the two, they play together as if they're ready. So they're exactly not the same, but they need to arrange with each other. And then they start to make a domus, so a house in a more complex sense than a house for a family or for an office or something like that. And that could be quite interesting to start to think then of a house as an oikos in a sense that is does not quite fall into the registers of either public or private or sacred architecture. But that needs to be invented, like the marriage between Dionysos and Ariadne is very different than between Hermes and Hestia. But they always represent principles or poles that kind of temper the spheres that unfold from their relation.
This tempering of the spheres. I stumbled recently on Sloterdijk.
Mm-hmm.
Is this precisely how he means it? He never sees an outside, from what I understand. It's always a matter of scalarity. When you get out of an inside, you always go into an outside.
Yeah. But say again, what did you mean about Sloterdijk? I'm not sure I understood well.
With Sloterdijk, from what I understand from his theory of the spheres,
mm-hmm.
and the envelopes, is that he never sees an outside. It's always a bigger envelope that we're engulfed into.
I mean, there is, for me, because Sloterdijk is, or has been, when I was younger, one of the few intellectuals which would kind of not shy away from involving practices like meditation and certain forms of practicing spirituality that are not associated with an institutionalized form into the intellectual life, let's say. I always appreciated this very much. And there is a certain period in my perception as well in his writing when this kind of got, let's say, far out of reach. But specifically in the Spheres books, the beginning of the first volume, to me, this was always one of the most it was yeah, sentimental, but it's from my development. I was puzzling. I found this I remember I called my master thesis Containing the Outside. I was already writing about the virtual, no? And I wanted to say, we don't need to contain the outside, not to keep it safe. We need to contain it for it to be open. This was what I was looking for, a paradoxical movement. But of course, I had no adequate words to describe this. But it is why I got interested in the differential and in the Baroque calculus. But then Sloterdijk writes in this first book about this the act of inspiration, when in the intimacy of not constructing oneself, but being a creature somehow of an outside force. It's about the evolution and the Stülpung of the relation of the containing and the contained, so that the two can almost conspire apart from the operations that defines them in their relation to one another. This was a kind of I don't remember now how it goes, but it was almost like possible to have a conspiration that transgresses this defining operation that constitutes you through the motion of practicing it. This is how he was describing the relation of the breathing, not the breathing life into man, was part of it. So I do think for Sloterdijk I would like to think that Sloterdijk is one of the persons who never quite abandoned this aspect of intellectuality. But it's also true that then, especially the third volume with the foam, it's very hard to find, if it is still there. No? Sometimes one also loses a bit good tempers for a certain while, and then they come back.
Containing the outside. This is also quite interesting, and I think it also finds now in this new text of yours, it swivels a bit into this idea of the portico.
Yeah.
The portico is, I doubt, it is a threshold, if we can think of it like that, but it's also containing the outside and the inside. In a certain way, no?
Yeah.
And you call it the portico of the arts, the kind of mingling space or place.
Yeah. Yes. Yes, this is because I think we can trust our thinking more if we think of it as embodied. So if we don't trust our consciousness of it, but our embodiment of it. So when we know we can have, it's like it has something to do with cultivating perhaps not methodical doubt. So, like, let's say the two poles that would be fields of danger is to kind of a distance-less affirmation, because this leads to, very charismatic, kind of fascinating and undemocratic and also unhealthy relations. But on the other hand, it's methodical doubt that you always need to make up basically a split mind with regard to things. But if we think of doubt and intuition as the two poles of a kind of a string, as an instrument, and then we can say the more we cultivate doubt, the more we can trust our intuition. Because the more refined, the less crude the schematisms, which kind of make intuition so immediate in its perception, becomes. So it has to do with this practicing of attention again. So then the intuition and the doubt, they go together. And still it's hard to think how one could practice this. And then Michel Serres has this beautiful passage in one of his last books, La Musique, where he describes the muses as the bringers of the arts, so the purposeless kind of. He describes the muses as something like capitals of ableness that have a kind of a genesis almost. So certain of the muses are first, and what they do is constitutive for their siblings to cultivate and become good in what they stand for. But they all basically help to forget historical things by interiorizing it and by sublimating it into motions, gestures, movements, feelings of tact, of rhythm, of all the things that the arts stand for. And with this notion at the Portico of the arts, first, what I would like to keep is that the arts are not. It's not right to think of the arts as a different discipline or domain than the sciences, because the kind of thing being inspired and also, this gets very cliche to say it so quickly, no, but it's just so the arts and science, it's not like they are different fields. So you need the rigor and the precision as an artist just as much as you need a kind of an attentiveness and a tolerance for fuzziness or for undecided things for a certain time as you do in the sciences. So the two cannot be two different things. And then we can think of it a bit like Irigaray. So Lucy Irigaray, she coins this notion of the portico as the place where the two sexes can have relations. No, so the portico is neither inside nor outside, and it's a place where, she says, where the saying can show itself. It's again a kind of a chiasmic. So what we say does not directly fall into a representational notion, but opens up more something like I try to call this, but I have not worked it out, the physics of respect, kind of an elemental passion that has to do with physicality, so with elements and the transformations and the compositeness of it, but still producing or cultivating a kind of respect. So letting be through producing a sort of intimacy that allows for the coexistence. And in her philosophy, the portico is the site where this is possible. So then this is what I was sympathizing with in this text, to say, well, this is maybe where the arts play a role for everything. No, they kind of give these elemental passions that allow different parties, differences to tune with one another, because it's not about recognizing themselves in the other. So it can transcend the recognition through a kind of a mutual capacity to act bodily with interiorized cognitions also, or on the basis, and a kind of a silent and implicit contract between the parties through recognizing what they value, where they give care, where they, I don't know, so something like this. It was a suggestive notion. It's not like I have a clear concept of it.
The portico.
The portico of the arts, yes.
Yeah, but the portico follows in a certain way also the rules of the cosmos. But there is a certain kind of cosmic decorum that is involved with the portico. When I heard the term portico, and as an architect, I already imagined the rows of pillars. I was wondering, and I've always wondered actually, especially with ideas, with the mathematics and with the obstacle, how much of a relation this has to Stoicism. So the portico for me is precisely this stoa poikile. You have where you can take a stroll. I'm curious if this has any relevance, or if Stoicism has any relevance in the whole constellation of thoughts that you have developed.
Yes, I guess it, in a certain sense, of course, it does. So, and it has something to do with this the axiology and the ethics, because this presupposes that one has a relation to oneself, which is not just mirrored through the social life around oneself, but through the philosophical questions of life and death and truth and all these things which are, of course, unachievable, but which also, I'm inclined to think more and more as I live with the dog, are not reserved for humans. So there are a way to kind of allegorize or symbolize how forms of life find tunings with one another that try to keep violence from happening. No? So to tune through a wielding of forces that are contracted and negotiated and evolution. So they're changing. They need to be, of course, sustainable, but they also need to be many things. So we have many scales, and they cannot be represented in one homogeneous space or time. And that's where music plays a role. So the musicality, because you can have the coexistence of several notes in one at the same time, and you still hear the distinctions. This is not possible with seeing, for example. And the Stoics, they were concerned with I guess with maxima and minima emotions, no? So with a kind of not doing the right thing in every moment, but keeping a peace of mind to a certain extent. Which, yeah.
No, the thing now, Stoic has a bit of a bad reputation as an adjective, an epithet, because Stoic means, or at least in the pop culture, Stoic means devoid of emotion, or
yes, yeah, but this is silly. But I understand is that it's kind of relativizing the role of the social life. You know,
Yes.
It kind of says, yes, I have my vertical conversations, no, at the same time as I have my horizontal ones. But then this is again the axiology. They don't need to compete. So if you cultivate the vertical ones, you can also have more diversified horizontal ones at the same time, because you don't need to recognize the same thing always. Yes. But it has a bad image today. It doesn't fit well in our time, the Stoic. Yeah.
Although it had like a resurgence, and New Age writers tried to pick it up in the pop culture, self-help series of books. And there is a specific one. It's called Daily Stoic, and he had picked up all the ancient Stoic writers and a few modern ones, because the 18th century, 19th century was full of practicing Stoics in quotation marks. Mm-hmm. And he has a specific book, which is, I think I read it before I took Elias's class on mathematics. And his book is called The Obstacle is the Key.
Okay.
He has a whole formula of how he names his books and how he orients his books. And one of them is The Obstacle is the Key. Kind of, in a way, it synchronizes a bit in a more simple way with the mathematical thinking that is proposed.
Interesting. I would be curious to look at this. Yes. No, for me, I hardly ever make the relation to the Stoics, but in a certain sense, of course, it's true that this kind of thinking and involution and practicing of so yes, I guess it is really there. But then it's also where I feel more inclined towards is that out of the Stoics evolved atomism, no, as a theory of combining a kind of a rationalism, a very strict formal rationalism, with something quite mystic at its core, because it would describe the deviations of things, not trying to name the essences. And it's more in this sense that I perceive the relations between category theory as well, because in category theory, you always deal with functors, not just functions. And that means when a function describes how a thing is transformed and becomes different through a certain action, category theory says, well, what are the morphisms that allow for this to happen? You don't address the object that transforms in its essence or in its representative content. You just codify the transformative motion that happens. And this has a lot to do with ancient atomism, this kind of thinking. Many people have pointed to that and said, actually, not that many. Prigozhin and Michel Serre. As a few more, of course, but it's not like common sense. No, everybody always accuses this mathematics for being dangerous because it's too abstract to be useful. No? So you have to start to speak so complicated about why you want to do it, to codify like this, and not just plainly in set theory terms that kind of seems to be closed by the common sense morals. But that's exactly what we need to reconnect with, in my understanding, yes. So yes, the story, okay, stoicism to a certain degree. Yeah.
Yeah.
True. But then, of course, the Portico, if we think of it in the, around the market for the Stoa, the whole has something to do with circling, no? So with embracing the obstacle, with going in rounds, because you kind of tune with what happens on the market, but also in many other things. But I was always thinking of the Portico, not so much in the public cityscape, but more almost like a balcony or a veranda. So a kind of an
Veranda.
Yeah, private. But this comes through really great. I'm just starting to think about these things. Also, the courtyard becomes super interesting. So if one gets this thing that you have a motion, a direction of a house, and also that means a quickness or a velocity even, because if there is motion, houses can be fast. And at the same time, a stance, or at least a position. And then the stance would be how you address the house in an evocative sense, how we would like it to develop in the future. And then these scales, they could, of course, accommodate ecological, sustainable. So as long as things are cyclical, there is almost no boundary to how far it could extend, this program. So why would the square, it does not need to translate into square meters if you think of a living body. Yeah.
Okay, I think we are slowly closing in.
Mm-hmm.
I think we can close up, and I will ask you, what questions do you think us architects should be asking today that we are not asking anymore?
That we are not asking anymore. Yeah, I think the question of scale. I mean, people are also architects, Ishigami and so on, are started to ask it again, but there was such a joint relief that scale and dimension collapsed. Well, and then you have the zoom motion, like in the IMS. But the scales are qualitative. We need to think the scales in material, in physical terms, and in aesthetic terms, not in algebraic terms purely, in algebraic geometry terms.
I will extend a bit the question now and ask, what is the difference between a scale and a scalarity?
Yes. I guess the scalarity tries to describe the qualitativeness that always is attached to a scale. So the scale then is a notion of scale, which is, it has more to do with almost like a balance. So where you put weight, you need to distribute weights. You need to try to distribute weights, but you can do this algebraically. So that means you can, you don't just have the gravity, you have factors of grace and of elevation at the same time, because it's an abstract procedure, not to proportion things well. So the scale is needed for proportioning things well, but the scale itself is not just the issue of the kilogram and the weight, but the scale is it's an issue of a cyclic, of a circulatory and an elemental kind of dynamics that involves also immaterial or informational processes. And to make this distinction, it was more just to be able to make this distinction. I started to speak of scalarity in my book of concert, and it was very difficult because the copy editors, with the one that I eventually worked, it went fine. So I could convince him that another work, so scaling wouldn't help, to mark the distinction. But it was very offending to the native speakers to speak of scalarity, to make up this word. And then I got stubborn and I insisted, because at least it keeps the distinction, but it's not like it's worth that as a concept. But I really so this I'm also telling myself, no, what should be asked today? We should really think about scale with regard to the cyclic. And that's also where the interest in axiology is coming from, ultimately. So to think about constellations of values and dynamics, which are also with direction. So they're not cyclic, like always the same. There is direction and sense and history and all of that, but it's also cyclical at the same time. And that's where my interest in metaphysics and metaphysical gestures is coming from for architecture theory, because it has such a rich repository of thoughts until the 19th century, even in the 20th century, in these old registers.
But scale in the algebraic. Think of scale in algebraic terms.
Algebra is not enough. It needs to be material too. But algebraic, yes. So the coding of the proportioning, this would be algebraic, but then the weight would be real. And that means the coding itself always has to bridge the asymmetry. It always has to involve somehow a translation of things. There is no commensurability to start out from.
And with the algebraicness, you also need a fulcrum. If you think in scales in this terms of if it scales for architects, we don't really go to think of the weights. We think of plans and of different.
Yes, but that's the reduction to the dimension, to the space.
Yes.
And this is a problem that we do that. Yeah. We need to think in coding.
We need to think in coding. That is
the
quantum literacy.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you very much.